everyone. So today we're going to be talking about the structure of a novel. And in my mind there's two different structures when you're thinking about novels. There's the plot structure, which most people are familiar with, and then there's the physical structure of how it's written on paper to meet the requirements of the plot structure. So come on and join me and we'll talk a little bit about the structure of a novel. I know you might be thinking, Dan, that made no sense whatsoever, but just bear with me and let's take a look at this slide that's on the screen, which I've titled Plot Structure, but you could easily call it Dramatic Structure. So this is the structure of a story. In the first example is the most basic version, where you start off with exposition, which is where you set up the environment and the characters. And then you have that little burst, which is the inciting incident, which causes the characters to do something because now there's a problem. And the rising action is where they're trying to take care of the problems until they get to the climax where, hey, they're either successful or they fail. And then there's always a little breathing space at the end of a story with falling action and a resolution. Now, example 2 is a little bit different because that's one for a action story or a thriller where it's action all the time, so you want a shorter exposition in the beginning and a shorter resolution, falling action and resolution at the end. The third example is really just a zoomed in version because in the rising action part of a story arc, you actually have multiple little problems that you have to overcome until you can get to the main problem at the climax. And then at that point, you have the falling action and the resolution. Pretty simple. People are also familiar with the 3 acts of a story. And so on this slide, I'm basically showing you on the right that you have Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3. And I'm going to overlay it so that you can just kind of see how it fits into the physical description or drawing of the plot structure. So that's the plot structure or the dramatic structure of a story overall. But I really want to talk about the structure of a novel, the physical structure. How does that translate onto the page? And how do you include these main story arcs and the secondary and tertiary story arcs? In my mind, there are 3 main structures to a novel. There's through line in parallel, through lines in sequence, and converging through lines. Now, all a through line is the story arc for each individual character, the main protagonist, the secondary and tertiary characters. And in the examples I'm going to give, the main protagonist will be in blue, and then the secondary and tertiary characters will be in red and in green. You're not going to write physically on the piece of paper where the words go up at an angle to show rising action and then come down to the resolution. You're writing on a flat medium. So how do you translate that dramatic structure into a story? And here's a good example. I call it through lines in parallel. And this is basically when the story is told from the same point of view from the beginning of the novel to the end of the novel, and the other characters here depicted in red and green come in and out of that orbit until the story is done. I personally find this structure to be difficult to do because all that dramatic structure has to be told and constructed through the same point of view. In this example of how the story is physically written on a piece of paper, I call it through lines in sequence, where you do have a main character and a main story arc, but individual chapters are told from different points of view. If you wanted an example of this format, we'll just look at Lord of the Rings. You start off with a fellowship, but at a certain point in the story, the fellowship is disbanded or dispersed into different groups, and then the story is told through the eyes of, or through the adventures of these different groups. So you've got Merry and Pippin, you've got Aragorn's story, and you've got Frodo's story, and each chapter switches between those those storylines. Now, of course, with Lord of the Rings, you could make the argument that there's not really a changing point of view. There's just subplots that are being told by the same narrator. But very often in these types of stories, you will go from the eyes of the main hero or the main protagonist into the eyes of the secondary or tertiary character, much like you do with the, what do you call that series? The Wheel of Time series. The big advantage to this format is, one, it allows you to write really 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 separate stories that are all tied into the main story arc, which allows you to expand the size of the story to multiple volumes or whatever. But it also gives you the chance to lay these suspenseful hooks at the end of every group's storyline, so that the reader always wants to know, well, what happened to that first group? What happened to that second group? What happened to that third group? And they won't figure that out unless they keep reading to the next chapter. So as a writer, you're hooking people with different storylines of 1, 2, or 3 chapters, which helps keep the reader interested in what's coming next. Now, a variation on that format for writing, where you have one chapter from one person's point of view, or telling one person's story and the next chapter telling somebody else's story, you can have a converging type of through lines, or a converging story, which means you don't start off with, or you don't identify the main story or the main protagonist. Everybody is equal in the eyes of the narrator. A good example is probably Game of Thrones. Who's the main character on Game of Thrones? I don't know. I guess the ones that don't die. And what everybody is waiting for is to see at the climax who wins. Because whoever wins, whoever gains power, which is what that story is about, will be the main character by definition. But up until that point, they're all different storylines. And from chapter to chapter to chapter to chapter, you're visiting each individual storyline to whatever conclusion that particular character ends up with. So for my money, there's a difference between the plot or the dramatic structure of a story and the physical structure on paper. How do you arrange your chapters and your points of view to tell that dramatic story? And for me, you have through line and parallel, where you typically have a main character, the protagonist, and the whole story is told through that person's point of view, and they're typically in every scene. Or there's through lines in sequence, where you typically have a group of people that come together and they're then split into their own individual storylines and reconverge at the climax. Or you have the converging through lines, where each character is introduced, they have their own storyline until you get to the climax, when the storylines converge to whatever the conclusion is. So my point is that there's a difference between the overall dramatic structure or the plot structure of a story and how that is written on the physical medium of the page. Where do you put your chapters, and what chapters deal with what group of characters or character throughout the overall arc of that dramatic structure of the story. I hope it's been helpful to you. I'd be happy to hear about your ideas on this topic, and I will see you next time around. Have a great week.
In the darkness, baby.